Neil, the floor is yours.
Welcome to this month's Courageous Conversations. I'm Neil Dupree with the Diversity Action Team, and my computer just okay. And I'm part of the planning team along with Amy Levy and Carrie Dre from Rock County YWCA and Amy Flowen with the Community Action of Rock and Walworth County. Diversity Action Team and YWCA are nonpartisan. Community action is apolitical. So tonight's discussion is about domestic violence, the differential impact on people of color. Domestic violence hits different. So if you'd like to be on our email reminder list, put your name in the chat room, please. The 4 agreements for Courageous Conversations are: stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept non-closure. The parts of the event may be recorded and used by media outlets if they're here with us. And at the end of the program at 7 p.m., partner sponsors will give announcements, and after that, all other participants are welcome to give announcements in the last half hour of unmoderated discussion. And we would like to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and 1 seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge that these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. Here you go, Amy.
Thank you, Neil. So we, as always, have some great videos for you to frame our discussion. We have a lot of content to get through tonight, so I'll play it by ear. I definitely don't want to stunt the discussion, but I'll manage that so we can get in as many of the videos as possible. If we do need to abbreviate any of them, rest assured all of the links will be in the chat so you can watch or rewatch those as your schedule will permit. So the first video we will watch, it's called "How Can We Combat Domestic Violence in Our Communities?"
Hello, everyone. Today's topic is a bit heavy, but it is a much needed conversation. Today, we are talking about something that affects every community, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, or privilege: domestic violence. I'm Shamika Sanders. Beside me is Kiara Kelly. Hey. And Africa Miranda. Make yourself comfortable. Another episode of Listen to Black Women starts now. How many deaths will it take in the Black community for us to start recognizing domestic abuse as an issue and advocating for survivors? Feminista Jones wrote in a Time article that for Black women, a strong sense of cultural affinity and loyalty to community and race renders many of us silent, so our stories often go untold. We see this often in pop culture with incidents like Chris Brown and Rihanna, Fabulous and Emily B., Ray Rice and his wife, who he punched out in the elevator and dragged out. The NFL has such an issue with domestic violence. We see this over and over. This all leads us to the question of the week. What can we do to combat domestic violence in our communities? Ladies, let's sound off on this.
I think one of the first things we can do is what we're doing now, which is talking about it. It's definitely mum in our communities, historically, generation after generation. This is something that our mothers have dealt with. Yes. And it's hard for people to see it as a problem because they're like, I dealt with it, I made it through it. Why now is this generation the one talking about it? But I think we're doing exactly that. And I think it's also just so hard for us because we're raised to protect the Black man at all costs, even if it's the cost to our own lives, our own bodies, our own families. And I think there comes a point where we have to turn that care internal. Absolutely. So that we can protect ourselves, so that we're not sacrificing our own livelihoods to protect our men.
Yeah, there's also a huge financial aspect of it because when you have physical violence within a relationship, it usually is coupled with financial abuse as well. So many men use their standing as the quote unquote head of the household to control the finances. So a lot of women can't even leave or, try to get to safety for themselves or their children because they literally cannot afford to do it. So they are stuck in this, this horrible situation with no way out.
Pop culture has normalized domestic abuse when we see incidents with Khalees and Nas, when a victim comes out and tells her story and people are quick to jump on the man's side. I remember when this came out and people were just like, no, couldn't be Nas.
Not our woke Nas.
Not Nas. Khalees was always.
Yeah, why'd she take so long? And
Why'd she take so long? So incidents like this we always see. It normalizes the fact that we don't see it as such an issue.
For most everyone in Black culture, the church is where you go for as your moral compass.
Yeah.
We make up, such a large, this huge religious population. And I think also that probably feeds into it as well, because so much in the church is about, keeping things within the family until, better or worse within marriages, and you don't want to break up the home. But women are suffering in silence.
As more and more people talk about this, they are taking to social media. So let's see what they all had to say about this. Fresh, a woman who tweeted, for anyone who knows someone in an abusive relationship, be that person's safe place. Don't judge them or make them feel embarrassed. Help them. You could be saving a life. And it was a thread. For anyone in an abusive relationship, I encourage you to get out, but more importantly than ever, do so safely. Because that is also an issue when talking about domestic violence, is being able to actually get away. Cardi B, not the rapper, tweeted, I remember watching a stand-up comedian one day, and he said, you hear a lot about crazy ex-girlfriend stories, mostly funny ones at that, but hardly ever any ex-boyfriend ones. Ever wonder why? People laughed, and he paused, because most women don't make it out alive.
Woo. I liked that tweet when it came down my timeline, and it's so real. For men, it's a funny story about a girl that maybe keyed their car. For us, it's a sad story of going to a funeral of a friend who died because her boyfriend beat her.
Someone else wrote, 41.2% of Black women will become victims of domestic violence. We love to talk about police brutality and racism. When are we going to talk about the brutality women, girls, and LGBTQ folks in our community are subjected to?
Yes, we can multitask. You can be very upset about, police violence and at the same time advocate for Black women who are being abused at the hands of Black men.
So let's move on to the receipts. Let's see what you guys are out there saying.
Yes, we asked you, the Hello Beautiful Madame Noir audience, which of the following happens during domestic violence? Physical abuse or emotional abuse, with 100% of you saying both, which is really great because I think a lot of times emotional abuse doesn't get identified as abuse because they're like, oh, these are words, sticks and stones, break my bones, words don't hurt. Words hurt. Words are harmful, and a lot of emotional abuse, it's a precursor to actual physical violence. We also asked, have you ever been hit by or hit your romantic partner, with 40% saying yes.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's almost half.
One thing to add, though, because I know we have a lot of men that love listen to Black women, is that domestic violence is not just, men abusing women. It's not like anytime it's happening within partners, whether it's a woman abusing a man or man abusing a woman, it's wrong.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of men don't come forward because there are men that are abused as well.
Yes.
And they get mocked, or it's a joke, or you're like, you can't get beat up, but it does happen. So I think that's also important in this conversation. One of the things that, a lot of times we don't recognize as a precursor to violence, or, and we touched on it, was emotional abuse. And while I've never been a victim of physical violence, I've absolutely been, in a relationship that was extremely emotionally abusive. And there's a great article that, we've run across and on Huffington Post by Pamela Jacobs. And she says that when we think of abusive relationships, we often picture black eyes and broken bones. But while abuse often escalates to physical violence, it does not start out that way. In fact, abusers are often charming, attentive, and sweet at the beginning of a relationship. And when I say that gives me chills, because that's how I felt. I was like, oh, he cares about where I'm going and wants to know where I am. And, you're equating all of this, to love, but then it starts to escalate into this abusive language and very controlling behavior, and who are your friends and who is that person you're talking to. And I think that's the thing that, if you're a viewer, that you should start to look out for those red flags, that someone may want to commit very quickly out the gate. He'll want you all to himself. He's super romantic. And not normal, nice romance, but overly romantic. And realizing that we can't always equate that with healthy love.
Yes. Can I ask how you began to identify those things as emotional abuse in your own situation?
It took a long time. It took like honestly, it started friends, like outside people were like, you're not yourself, you're not okay. And I also realized that I was changing my behavior. Like I wouldn't, I would make sure that I called him as soon as I was somewhere. I would never let my phone out of my sight because if he didn't reach me, he would be upset.
Yeah.
And then as it can, I let him be a part of like my business and my life. And I just realized I had let this one person like control almost everything about me, start to alienate people. And then when I realized what was going on and tried to separate myself, that is where I started being concerned for my safety, because certain things were said that it wasn't like a direct threat, but that it's a threat.
You said something really important too about it escalating, because I found with my own situation with domestic abuse is that it gets worse and worse. Like each incident gets worse and worse because you've allowed that person to do one thing and now they take that and then they take another inch and then another inch. The next thing you know, you're in the hospital. Because if you guys actually look up domestic violence and look at the cycle, it starts with all the emotional stuff. And then it's like, you kind of feel like, oh my God, I did something wrong. And then they look like the hero. Then the incident happens. And then it's the honeymoon phase afterwards.
There's this thing I feel like with Black love and life and family is that violence is so much of our story. Slavery, of course, is absolutely violent. So then we beat our children. We have violence within our relationships. And until we address the violence in every part of our lives, that's the only way I think that we're going to start having real healing. Because if you have 29.1% of Black women that are going to experience some sort of intimate partner violence, that's a lot of women.
Yeah, you brought that up. I was like, whoa.
To delve deeper into this conversation, we spoke with Cheryl Hatwood, who's the founder of Endless Voice Productions and is also a domestic violence survivor. To learn a little bit more about her experiences and gain more insight, please log on to madamenoir.com.
Ladies, another insightful conversation, one that must be had. What did we learn and what are the takeaways we can share with our audience?
Yes, I think one thing that's important is not to judge. I personally have never been a victim of domestic abuse, but I was a bystander to it. And I think it's very frustrating when you're watching your loved one continually go back to these situations. And I think it's important for them to have allies. You don't want them to be isolated even more than they already are, because their family and friends have now decided, well, we're just done with you because you won't be done with this. So I think it's very important to hang in there. Remember that they're the ones going through it, not actually you.
I would say that if we want to start breaking the chains of violence within our community, we can't throw people away. We should be reaching out to abusers and children and really teaching people, kind of as you said, there are better ways to deal with conflict, better ways to deal with anger and trauma rather than resorting to violence.
My takeaways from this conversation is to be aware and to educate yourself. If you're going through this situation, go to the internet, look up the signs of domestic abuse, and check it out for yourself. Thank you guys for tuning into another insightful but necessary conversation on Listen to Black Women. Until next time, stay blessed.
All right. So much to unpack there. I am going to drop a few items in the chat that I just want to see if we have time to touch upon. But if something stood out in that incredible video that's different than what I have, this is definitely not an exhaustive list. So as we're reviewing the chat and looking at that list and thinking about what we want to share with the group, most of us are regulars, but Kim, I just wanted to pause and welcome you to our Courageous Conversations. If you want to briefly introduce yourself, go ahead. Hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot too much.
No, that's okay. I'm Kim Rao. I work with the Rock County District Attorney's Office in the Victim Witness Program. My specialty is in domestic violence. I'm also an expert witness and testify in a lot of criminal, family, and civil court cases in regards to domestic violence and the dynamics of that.
Perfect. So I am certain that we are going to be leaning on your expertise and experience this evening. So feel free to chime into the discussion in the chat. 4 things that really stood out to me: generational responses to violence, Black women's instinct to protect Black men, financial violence, and religious influences to keep your family together. So in no particular order. And if there are other things that resonated with you, feel free to share. I think we're a small enough group tonight. If you want to just jump in, just unmute and go. If we find that we're stepping all over each other, we'll go back to putting a question mark in the chat, and I'll call on you in the order that they appear.
Struck me that gaslighting happens, that people become convinced that they actually deserve this kind of treatment. And that's part of the emotional violence, I think.
Definitely. And you'll see as we progress through the videos, we were very intentional of showing different perspectives and different stories of what domestic violence looks like.
I think class is an issue too, that we're likely to think that it's poor people that have domestic violence issues, black and white alike. But that can happen in any social strata. I just lost my place there and I don't know. Okay. I lost my face and I lost it. But I think class is something to think about. You can't think, oh, they have so much money, there's no reason for domestic violence. That's certainly not true.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Janet. And we'll hear a story from a woman later on. And I'm just going to be completely honest. I'm like, I don't want to give it away. It blew me away. And I'm like, you have agency and you know better. And why wouldn't you leave? And that's why I think one of the things, I didn't jot it down as one of my 4 points in the chat, was do not judge. Because the last thing that you want is for someone that you care about to be isolated. So if they get to a point where they're interested in leaving, they don't feel like they have any resources or anyone that they can turn to. And like they pointed out in the video, it is not happening to you. You can endure the frustration. They're dealing with the real problem. Susan, go ahead and unmute.
And from what I've seen, overall backgrounds is that young girls, before they're really ready in terms of having a solid sense of themselves and having courage inside, they're so encouraged to date so early that they might get into these situations before they even know it, because they're encouraged to date heterosexually, and a lot of that is homophobia in the background, and it's not really in the foreground, but it's very much in the background. That and young girls kind of jump into things early because they don't want anyone thinking they're gay or what have you. And it's really sad that they don't give themselves the chance to just grow themselves for a while, you know what I mean? And not jump into relationships so quickly.
So Susan, thank you for contributing that. You all are making me feel great about our video selections. That is going to be addressed in the spoiler alert. We've introduced this actually at a previous Courageous Conversations, but it is relevant for this one as well. There's a report called Girl Interrupted, and it talks about some of the things that Susan just highlighted with respect to how Black girls are seen, and being more mature, less needing of care at earlier ages. So there's a video that will beautifully describe that much better than I just did, and we'll get to that shortly. One thing that I just wanted to put in the chat to remind us is that the Institute on Women's Policy Research shows that approximately 31% of all women will experience domestic violence, and for Black women, that statistic is closer to 40%. So just wanted us to keep that at the forefront as we continue in these conversations and watch the videos. So speaking of, I will get our next video set. If I'm remembering correctly, this one does have some graphic imagery. So if you have young viewers in the room with you, you may want to ask them to step aside for the next video. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
These days, conversations about sexual violence and harassment towards women have infiltrated popular culture, the news, heck, they're all over our timelines. And there's one group that's almost invisible when it comes to these conversations: Black girls and women. So why are we being ignored? Today's baggage: silencing Black sexual violence survivors. Far too often, Black women are the victims of sexual violence. Get this, about 1 in 5 Black women in the United States have experienced rape in their lives. And just under half of Black women said that they experienced sexual violence other than rape. But let's talk about the culture of sexual violence towards Black women in America, a country with an unequivocally racist and sexist history. The fact is that Black women aren't being heard.
Black women have just walked unprotected through history in this world.
Deborah Gray White is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. Yeah, and she's kind of a big deal. When did we first see this idea that Black women were sexually promiscuous?
This notion that Black women are promiscuous in America evolved. When whites went to Africa, they actually saw African women unclothed in their native environment. So they immediately associated that with promiscuity for both men and women.
What happened once enslaved Africans were brought to America and slave laws were created?
Black women get absolutely no protection. No one is really policing her body. Policing of her body occurs to the extent that she can prevent it from happening. Now you have to make it her fault because, these people are promiscuous. She's lascivious. She asked for it. She wanted it. As long as she is the property of a slave master, he can do with her anything he wants to do. It's economically beneficial to the master because all of the children that come from this Black woman, whether they are his or not, they become slaves.
When slave masters raped their slaves, it wasn't considered illegal. But when the enslaved defended themselves, there were grave consequences, like in the case of an enslaved woman named Celia. As a teen, Celia was sold to a white slave owner who regularly raped her and impregnated her twice. Celia later began a relationship with a fellow slave who demanded that she end relations with her slave owner. When the slave owner tried to rape her again, Celia killed him and was later sentenced to death by hanging.
There's no sympathy for her, the fact that she had been raped for over 4 years repeatedly. The Black man who is a part of this whole relationship bear no responsibility for his actions.
How did the rights of Black women who were victims of sexual violence change after emancipation?
African-American women immediately try to exercise their new citizenship right by pressing charges against both Black and white men who raped them.
Like in the case of Reese Taylor, a Black woman who was gang raped in 1944 by 6 white men. One of the assailants even confessed, but 2 grand juries, both full of white men, would not indict the rapist. Because liberty and justice for all? In her book, Aren't I a Woman?, Dr. White found that for a period of nearly 100 years after slaves were freed, there wasn't a single Southern white man convicted of raping or attempting to rape a Black woman, though it was fairly common during that era. But Black women weren't just assailed by white men.
Most Black women are raped. They're not by white men today. And if Black men tend to be perpetrators of sexual abuse on Black women, then we need to talk about that.
You see, the legacy of sexual violence towards Black women and our subsequent silencing runs deep. As sexual violence towards Black women goes on, one woman's changing the narrative, turning victims into survivors.
Sexual violence is not about sex, right? It's about power, and it's about the abuse of power.
Tarana Burke is an activist and a sexual assault survivor. She founded Me Too in 2006. Burke's movement supports survivors and calls on the public to bring sexual violence to an end. Although Me Too has solidified its place in American culture, Black girls and women are still largely left out of the conversation.
It's painful to watch Black women not be included in this popular narrative. It's painful to see people preface the pain of other people over ours and not give any credence to the trauma, the layers of trauma that happen in our community.
Burke says that there is an internalized oppression in the Black community. This oppression has caused Black people to protect Black male predators because the community values them. We're so used to seeing Black men oppressed by the state and forces of systemic racism that we can't help but wonder, would we be doing the same?
This decision becomes that, do I protect the name and good, the legacy of this Black person versus the people who they harmed? And that's a struggle we've had around for a long time. We are literally in a moment where Russell Simmons has 18 credible allegations against him that range from sexual harassment to sexual assault. Nobody has labeled him a predator. Nobody said he's ravishing the community. Nobody's talked about that. And he hasn't been accountable for it either. It's not new to Bill Cosby or R. Kelly or anybody else.
While Bill Cosby is serving jail time after he was convicted of sexual assault, Russell Simmons and R. Kelly deny all current allegations against them. About Robert Sylvester Kelly. Lifetime recently released a gut-wrenching documentary, Surviving R. Kelly, that shed light on the depths of his alleged sexual deviancy. The man's been accused of statutory rape, sexual assault, and having a sex cult. Allegations even come from a woman he exchanged vows with. I'm actually R. Kelly's ex-wife. Andrea Kelly is among the dozens of women who have come forward to speak out against her ex-husband. She met Robert Kelly at 19, and they were married for over a decade. During that time, Andrea Kelly says that she was physically, verbally, and economically abused.
It was a whirlwind. The bruises go away. I suffer from PTSD still. Hummers used to be a thing that would trigger me because that was the first time that I really thought that man was going to kill me. And it was in the backseat of a Hummer because I thought this Hummer is going to eventually be my casket.
But Andrea got the courage to come forward after she saw Geronda Pace, another woman who spoke out against R. Kelly on The Real.
He would slap you in your face and he would physically harm you. And he would put you in a room and he would lock you in the room for days.
I felt like she came forward and it fell on deaf ears. But if we are to be very real, because we're women of color, it keeps falling on deaf ears. Because if that was Amber on The Real, if that was Becky on The Real, if that was Hannah on The Real, Andrea Kelly wouldn't be sitting here today. We'd be done with this.
And Andrea Kelly brings up a valid point. These cries have fallen on deaf ears because R. Kelly's alleged victims are Black girls and women. But it's bigger than R. Kelly. Y'all, let's talk about what's happening to Black girls. A Georgetown law study, Girl Interrupted, found that compared to white girls, Black girls from ages 5 to 14 were perceived to need less protection, need to be supported less, need to be comforted less, are more independent, and know more about sex. This study alone proves that Black girls aren't looked at as girls at all. Throughout history, men of all races tried to exercise control over the bodies of Black girls and women, asserting their power to dictate how and when we have sex. But it's a new day.
This thing is not just about our individual bodies. It is about how the insidiousness of sexual violence tears at the fabric of our communities. And I think people are finally getting that and they're committing to this work in a real way.
Your experiences and your voice matter. Black girls, Black women, continue to speak out. Even if the world doesn't hear you, we hear you.
All right, so give me a moment to put the information for the last video in the chat. While I'm doing that, feel free to unmute if there's something that resonated with you. And just for reference, that video was 4 years old. I know it referenced a couple court cases, so just to give you some context of when that was produced. So as I put the link for that video in the chat, and queue up our next video that talks about the report that they referenced. And again, that's Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. I will put the link for the PDF. It's about 23 pages long, but it's a really important read. So that's the next thing I put in the chat. Before we move to our next video, are there any comments or questions that you want to pose to the group? Is there anything that resonated there with the history of violence, specifically sexual violence against Black women? Susan, go ahead.
Sure. What resonated with me was the fact that in one sense, whites have considered African Americans completely in a sexualized way, a hypersexualized way, that it's part of the dehumanization of African Americans, which has been going on for a very, very long time. That was something that really bounced out at me, but also the fact that the slave owners, I mean, almost every slave owner did rape their female slaves. They did. I mean, you hear it when you watch that show, Finding Your Roots. You really see it over and over again.
And the male and the enslaved males were raped in many cases as well. And I think it was the first video that like put it very simply, sexual violence isn't about sex, it's about an abuse of power. Yeah. Anyone else from that video before we watch? And it's pretty quick. It's 2 minutes and some change, but I think it does a really great job of describing the Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood, the report. Janet, go ahead.
I've taught women's studies for a number of years, and I believe that the numbers that are given here, 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 1 in 3 even, are low. They don't express the number of women that have been sexually abused and raped. And I think, for one thing, girls and young women, I mean, even older women, don't understand that they have been sexually abused in a way that's illegal and that is detrimental to them, because they've been taught about romance and Gone with the Wind. And I was thinking of the Every Step You Take, that stalking song that at first we thought was so romantic, and took a while to realize that I'll Be Watching You is not positive. It's a really negative and ugly song, but viewed as romantic. So I think that was brought up earlier, but I think more girls and women need to learn what it really means, what that kind of thing really means.
Yeah, Brittany, please unmute.
So through this, I was a survivor of domestic abuse from an African American man. My child is a product of rape from an African American man, and everything that we've seen in these last 2 videos, I'm very like pins and needles-y, because I haven't really thought about this. And just like they say that the African American women don't come forth and they don't talk about it, either do white girls who have survived it either, because it's just being a survivor, you don't necessarily talk about it, you just try to move past it. And everything that has been talked about in both videos resonate really deep. That idea of that romance, bringing bringing you in. I was a very young girl. I was not, I was naive in the fact that I thought that it was true romance, and it wasn't. It was the start to a very cyclical, abusive behavior. And when my daughter was born, it just going to that second video, he was at the hospital and he left because he didn't want to be there. And when the nurse had asked why he was leaving, and the nurse knew that I was being abused before I even realized I was being abused, his response, and I'll never forget this ever, was, "I don't need to be here because back in the day, Black women would have a baby and get their ass back in the field. So I don't need to be here." And that was soul crushing. But then moving into this third part, and within the days that I finally realized and left was when he brought friends over, and my daughter was 9 months old, and they had comments about how beautiful she was, this 9-month-old baby, and how she was going to develop in just a few years, and then they could look at her more. And that was when I realized that it was done. And so you're blind by it a lot. I mean, I'm sure, Kim, you can attest to knowing people that go through this. You're blind to it until you really see it. And you just think that it's part of the journey, and you try to stay for whatever reason, family, whatever. And this is all so true. And it's for every person or any race. But there was also that feeling that, and he consistently would bring color into it and say, "You're leaving because I'm Black." And that was never the case. It was because of the abuse. And so as a firsthand individual, everything here today is 100% accurate from a survivor's perspective.
Brittany, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else before we watch the clip that focuses on Girlhood Interrupted? All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, less support, less comfort. They know more about adult topics, including sex. New research shows these beliefs are widely held in the United States. A groundbreaking report from Georgetown Law's Center on Poverty and Inequality finds that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers. The study builds on previous research that found adults view Black boys as less innocent than white boys, starting at age 10. The new study is the first to focus on girls and finds significant adultification bias against Black girls as young as 5 and rising through age 14. The findings may help explain why Black girls face harsher treatment than white girls, both in school and in the juvenile justice system. Black girls are 5 times more likely to be suspended than white girls and are punished more for minor subjective offenses like dress code violations, disobedience, and disruptive behavior. Schools are more likely to call the police on Black girls. White girls account for half of all girls in school, but only a third of the girls referred to police, and 30% of the girls arrested. Black girls are less than 16% of girls in school, but account for 28% of police referrals and 37% of arrests. Past research has shown prosecutors drop 7 out of 10 cases against white girls, while only dropping 3 out of 10 against Black girls. This data suggests bias plays a role when officials exercise discretion. Now, the new evidence that adults see Black girls as needing less comfort and less protection begs the question: how can we ensure that stereotypes of Black women as combative and hypersexualized don't reach into our schools and playgrounds and erase childhood for Black girls?
So if you couple that video and that report, and I think the date that report was released was 2017. Think about the pipeline to abuse. And if this is how our girls are treated and viewed at such a young age, how does that play a role in the treatment that we endure in many cases and accept in some cases in adulthood? So I just wanted to have that as a point of context. Any comments? Is anyone familiar with the report, or you've heard about it, or you've perused it before this discussion tonight?
I have heard of it, and I think one of the reactions that I have is that when children in general are expected to perform at a higher level than is developmentally appropriate for them, there's a lot of anxiety and resentment, confusion, very disorienting for them because they're expected to know something, or behavior is attributed to them that they don't have the capacity to manage. And so when then if they're seen as angry, disruptive, etc., it's really a setup for them because they don't know how to respond, and people are expecting something of them that they can't exhibit. And so when I saw that picture of the girl lying on the floor, I'm thinking, I wonder what she said, ahead of time, in her anger, in her confusion, in her frustration, that got such a brutal response. It's all a setup for them.
Sally, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's critically important of the extreme that you're describing. But even as a parent, my children are absolutely lovely. And yes, I'm a little biased, but they've always been very mature in certain ways, like with language and with behavior. And I would catch myself when they were little and I'm like, what in the world are you doing? And I'm like, oh, that's right, you're still a baby. Like, you're still a toddler. But if you don't take that moment and kind of check yourself, someone who loves and adores them can, and definitely not the extremes that you're describing, but can have a response that, again, is not aligned with where they are emotionally and developmentally, etc. And when you are in the presence of people that don't have that care and compassion for you, the things that Sally is describing can be just grossly inappropriate and damaging to children. So yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. All right.
And
so,
I would just like to offer another tiny comment, and that is related to the size of children too, because children who are taller than their age mates, if they're not in third grade or, with their peers, they can be expected to be more mature. I'm a small woman, and when I had small children and I put them, for example, on a counter while I was paying my check or something, people would like lunge and try to grab them because they looked so small and developmentally, younger than they were. So it was such a clear emphasis to me that the size makes a difference too. So if you have a tall Black girl or a tall Black boy, people are expecting that they are acting like 7th graders when they're actually 5th graders. And that's just another piece of sensitivity I think we have to put into this.
Absolutely. And thank you for keeping us mindful. All right. So we have something a little new for Courageous Conversation. So go with me on this one. We are going to take about 30 seconds and I'm going to get my timer out. But whenever you do an exercise like this, 30 seconds probably feels like closer to 30 minutes. Here we go. What does domestic violence look like and how does it thrive? Just think about it. If you want to jot it down, you can do that. I will not ask you to share your responses with the group. That is a completely, up to you. If you want to share, we'll have time for that. But I will not call anyone out. So just a heads up. So again, before I start this timer, we're going to do 30 seconds. What does domestic violence look like? And how does it thrive? Go. All right, and that's 30 seconds. So hopefully that didn't feel too long. If there is anyone who would like to share, I'm going to stop talking. If no one responds, that is completely fine. That will just signal that we're ready for our next video. All right, here we go.
Okay, so I want to talk to you about domestic violence. I know it's not a popular subject, but it's one that we should be talking about because it affects all of us. Domestic violence doesn't care about where you're from, your political affiliation, or even the color of your skin. It doesn't ask if you're the CEO of a company or a waitress at the local diner before it strikes. It lurks in the dark shadows of our lives, and it's in our silence that it thrives. I know domestic violence intimately. I spent 30 years in abusive relationships because I was too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening to me. A few years ago, I stared at myself in the mirror, scanning my body for bruises to take photos of. Moments before, I had been pinned to my bed by my abuser as he punched me repeatedly. I laid there praying that he would do enough damage that it would be visible. And I know that's an odd thing to say, that I wanted to be hurt badly enough that it would be evident, but I needed the proof that this was real. Not to show the police or even family or friends. I needed the proof for myself because I too had bought into the lie that domestic violence was someone else's problem. Let me take you back to the beginning. The first time my abuser held me against the wall while pressing his forearm into my windpipe until I nearly passed out. The second time, my abuser picked my pregnant body up by one arm and leg and then dropped me on the floor. The eighth time, my abuser called me into our bedroom to scold me for inviting a friend over. He threw me on the bed, sat on top of me, and began choking me. My friend came in the room and tried to stop him, but he threw her into a bureau, and she wasted no time calling the police. The moment my abuser was taken to jail, I forgot all about my trauma. I was worried about him and knew that I didn't want to be responsible for yet another Black man who needed help, ending up in handcuffs. Over the next 24 hours, I pleaded with my friend to drop the charges. And she refused at first, but eventually she did. My abuser promised never to do it again. And that was a promise that I didn't know then he didn't have the capacity to keep. After a few months, the abuse would resume and it would worsen. It happened so many times, I lost count. For my own protection, I diminished my once fun-loving personality until I felt invisible. I avoided friends and family as often as I could, and I avoided every social event until my friends stopped inviting me. I hid my shame and my pain behind a 145-pound weight gain, and I felt so lonely and so worthless that I thought no one would miss me if I was dead. Then one day, I had a conversation with a friend and mentor who I hadn't talked to in 20 years. We laughed and reminisced about old times. And while I said very little about my home life, he sensed something wasn't right with me. And he asked, "Does he hit you?" No one had ever asked me that before. And I didn't know how to respond, so I sat there in silence, waiting for him to change the subject. Ashamed that I hadn't done enough to hide my secret. A few days later, my friend texted me and he said, "You don't have to stay in an abusive situation. Don't ever forget, you're the prize. You are the prize." Those words saved my life. My friend did something no one up to that point had done. He saw me. He saw my pain, and he reminded me of my worth. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't before. I felt hope. 1 in 3 women will be victimized by domestic violence in their lifetime. Take a minute to think about that. 1 in 3. That means if you know 3 women, then you know someone who's been abused, or maybe you are the victim. Every minute, 20 people are abused by an intimate partner in the United States. And each day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls made to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. And get this, domestic violence costs a startling $8.3 billion per year. For Black women like me, the numbers are even more dire. 40% of us will be victimized. With 43 million Black women in the US today, that means 17 million women will experience domestic violence. It's because of these staggering statistics that the Black Women's Health Project has determined that domestic violence is the #1 health issue facing Black women today. Yet we're among the least likely to report. Now, the reasons we don't report vary, but there are a few recurring themes, like the fact that mass incarceration of Black men in record numbers has already crippled the Black family structure. And reporting domestic violence just takes another Black man out of the picture. Or our fear that we'll end up on the wrong side of the law, facing decades in prison for defending ourselves against our abuser, like our sister, Marissa Alexander. To add insult to injury, our community suffers from a long-standing history of cultural taboos that support silencing our pain. We're trained early on not to air our dirty laundry, that what happens behind closed doors stays there, and that what happens between a man and a woman, it stays between them. We've also normalized violence against women in our Black culture. Misogynistic portrayals of Black women, dating back to Blaxploitation films, still infiltrate our music and film today, perpetuating the idea that Black women are to be used and abused, expendable. I know the impact of these things all too well. Although things became physical in my relationships, I never identified myself as a battered woman. In fact, I thought it was just simply the way that we got along, how we loved. Saying that aloud, it sounds and feels foolish. Who would ever confuse being battered with love? So the question is, why didn't I just leave? Well, the simple answer is, I didn't know how. While the bruises healed, the damage done by decades of psychological and verbal abuse rendered me incapable of thinking for myself. Simple decisions like what to cook for dinner were monumental events for me. I couldn't trust myself because for as long as I could remember, every thought I had been imposed upon me by my abusers. Remember when I told you that my mentor said that I was the prize? Well, it would be 10 years after that before I would be strong enough to leave. I knew that in order to get out, I needed to start telling my story. And although the shame weighed heavy on me, I started confiding in friends and family. And each time I told my story, I felt stronger. When I thought I was ready to leave, I got a new job. A childhood friend offered me a place to stay, and I moved 925 miles away from my abuser, but I couldn't shake him. He called me daily, guilting me for leaving and asking me to come home. I didn't want to, but when my job was eliminated and I didn't have an income or a permanent place to stay, I had no choice but to go back. I would repeat the cycle of walking away only to be pulled back into the abuse 5 times. I suffered from depression, panic attacks, and endured physical injuries that will be with me for the rest of my life. Despite what people would like to think, domestic violence isn't the result of bad romantic luck or misfortune. It doesn't happen because 2 incompatible souls happen to collide. It's deeply rooted in other forms of unresolved trauma. Mine stems back to when I was sexually abused as a child by people I trusted. I learned to cope by numbing myself against the pain. And later, when I found myself in abusive relationships, I would call upon that coping mechanism to save me again. The good news is, for one, I'm still standing. And my abuser has begun his healing journey and has committed himself to helping other men who need healing too. I know the enormity of domestic violence cannot be summed up in a TED Talk, but I believe that this is where the conversation to end it begins. As a survivor, I feel I owe it to those living in silent pain to speak up and speak out. As a community, we can all listen without judgment. And we can use the resources that are available to us in social media, in the workplace, places of worship, and in our local communities to stand with the 1 in 3 and let them know they're not alone and that they matter to us. And to those who are still living in the dark shadows of abuse, hear me when I say, silence is not strength. Your voice is your power. If you think no one sees you, know that I see you, and others see you too. And I want you to know that you too are indeed the prize. Thank you.
Prize or price?
All right, so a lot to unpack there. What resonated with you all? And before we start chiming in, again, no obligation to share, but think about what you wrote or what you thought about to the question of what does domestic violence look like and how does it thrive? All right, what resonated?
I'll share. So what resonated with me was about silence, about not saying anything for whatever your reason not to say something. And yes, part of it is, right? Like I grew up in a time where if you had a relationship, you didn't talk, about your relationship with others, that what happened between a man and woman was between that man and woman. And I think when I was young, I was like 14 till I was about 19. I had one boyfriend that, early on in high school that I thought, like everybody else, to the first video, that's, get in a relationship. And somebody, I think it was you, Susan, who talked about young women getting into a relationship young because you feel that's the thing that you're supposed to do. So I remember doing that because I wanted to be like everybody else, fit in, have a boyfriend, and had a relationship with somebody for 5 years. So as I, all the way until I got to college, my freshman year in college. And just remember being, like I wrote down words like love. It looked like love when we were in front of other people, right? But when we were alone, it looked more like fear, right? And to me, the way the whole relationship thrived because of control, right? Control. And I think luckily, I don't know if this is luckily, most of the abuse was social emotional, being put down repeatedly over time. You're not good enough, you're stupid, you're dumb, right? You hear that for a long time. And then I remember at the end of those 5 years, being strong enough to get away. But that is when probably something physical was starting, physical abuse was pending. And I know from learning years later that a woman who he had 4 children with had a restraining order against him and he physically abused her. So, it was just a matter of time, right? And I think the silence, the culture in Hawaii is very Asian. So men in the Asian community are the top of the food chain. Women are at the bottom of the food chain. And so there's even a greater reason to be silent, I think, culturally. But I remember going back to Hawaii maybe like 5 years ago and talking to one of my good friends, my best friend who lived down the road, and thinking that when I went through this, that I had to have talked to somebody. Like, to this day, I still can't remember a lot about what happened during those 5 years between him and I. Like, I just really can't remember it. And I talked to her and I said, "Anne, did I ever talk to you about that?" And she said, "You never once mentioned it to me." And it hit me like a ton of bricks that I didn't, and I definitely didn't say anything to my parents, my mother, my father, my sister, nobody. So if I didn't tell her, I didn't tell anybody for like, 5 years in this relationship. And yeah, so silence, like you thinking that you can't talk about it. And then when you finally do, it's hard. It's hard for me to think now how big a role that played in my life, for the last, gosh, I'm not going to tell my age, but 40 plus years, it's a long time to just come to grips with it maybe 5 years ago and wonder a lot of things, but I just can't remember anything, So that resonated with me quite a bit.
No, Heidi, thank you for sharing that. And when she said, silence is not a superpower, and I may have that wrong a little bit, but like, your silence is not your strength. And part of how she was able to leave, she said she knew that she had to start telling her story. And then if you go back to the beginning, when she was talking about the physical abuse and she was hoping that it left a mark, not so she could report it or she would, have proof, but so that it would be real to her. And when I was listening that's the first time, and I'm like, how could it not be real to you? And then when she talked about it, kind of in the middle of her TED Talk, that what was her verbiage? That she had convinced herself that she wasn't abused, even though it had gotten physical. And I'm like, and again, you want to come from a space of not judging, but wanting to understand so that you can be helpful. But I don't think I've quite wrapped my mind around that. Is that how you could be in a physically abusive relationship, but still not believe that that is abuse? But that's what she said, so I believe her. So as we shift into the conversation, and in the spirit of full transparency, and the planning committee can attest to this. So the last video that we will watch is focused on former abusers. And part of me was like, I don't want to share the platform with abusers because this is about the women and uplifting their story, and how can we be helpful to them? And then part of me was like, well, Amy, if you're not willing to look at the full equation, then how are you really helping anyone? And I think it may have been in the first video, when one of the co-hosts spoke to, we have to look at everyone. And if women are in the mainly heterosexual relationships that are being abused, and the percentages that they laid out, this isn't a woman's problem. This is a men's issue. And so we have to look at that side of the equation. And then I can't remember what number video it was. Oh, actually, it's in the next one. I almost gave it away. All right, we're gonna show the video unless someone else wants to share. We got a little bit of time. Yep, Janet, go ahead.
I think in some ways it's easy from what I've seen. I used to also work on the helpline at the Y years ago, from women, is that it's hard to see that you're in a cycle of, if you're in an abusive situation, if that cycle thing is working, because the cycle of abuse leads to rising tension and so on, and then the abusive act, and then afterward there's that honeymoon period, and then you can look at the honeymoon period and say, no, he really loves me. Oh, he just, what did I do? What did I do to make him so mad that he got that abusive? And now he's really sweet and he gives me things and he's sorry and all that kind of stuff. So the abuse in a way is masked then if you don't understand how that cycle works.
Thank you for that, Janet. All right, I'm going to share my screen. We'll watch our final video and then we will continue our conversation.
Every relationship I was ever in was abusive. I'm a recovering person, and I'm recovering from many, many things. One of them is domestic violence.
Jackie regularly comes here to San Bruno Jail to confront perpetrators of domestic violence face to face. She works with Resolve to Stop the Violence, the first program in the country to work with incarcerated men to confront their history of domestic abuse through restorative justice.
One of the things that I'm stricken by is I look around and I see an absolute melting pot. And I can't think of an issue that is more transcending in cultures than domestic violence.
The first step usually was the verbal coercion, the threat. Very quickly after, it would like be a backhand or a slap. We call it chin checking, right? Just whack, whack. And it escalates from there.
Jimmy Espinoza spent much of his life abusing women before going through RSVP. He's now a facilitator for the program.
Once I can objectify a woman and then put a hand to her and gain that, like, see, I told you, then the ass whoopings would escalate, right, to full out beatings. I never questioned that I wasn't right.
Rehabilitation programs for abusers are controversial, particularly when they're proposed as an alternative to incarceration. We sat down with Lee Goodmark, a lawyer and professor who writes extensively about the case for decriminalizing domestic violence.
How effective is restorative justice? There are pockets of programs across the country that have tried to do this work, and some of them are doing amazing work around kind of the three central questions of restorative justice, right? What was the harm? What was the impact of that harm? And how do we hold this person accountable? What do they need to do to be able to make that harm whole?
We've heard so many horrific stories over the last several months. Some of these guys are monsters. Why advocate for them?
I don't see it as advocating for them. I see it as advocating for their partners. The criminal legal system is the primary policy vehicle that we've chosen to deal with domestic violence in the United States. And I just think that's not a realistic way to deal with this problem. It's not lowering rates of domestic violence. And in many cases, it actually exacerbates the factors that cause domestic violence in the first place.
How's that?
So for example, under and unemployed men are more likely to commit domestic violence. When you put someone through the criminal legal system, it's much more difficult to get a job. Similarly, trauma and violence are highly correlated with domestic violence. So we send you to a place that is violent, and then you go back into your community. And so I've come to believe that while we need the legal system as a backstop for those crimes that are so egregious that we need to have people kind of not among us, we're really failing to do any of the kind of preventative work we need to be doing to stop the violence before it starts.
I was subjected to just about every form of abuse by being in this marriage. There was always this level of emotional abuse where he would belittle me. He would remind me that I was nothing without him. That might not seem so bad in one particular episode, but just imagine years and years and years and years of hearing that. What it did, the impact to him on my self-esteem and self-worth. I thought I could do nothing on my own. Then there was the beat down. And this was a ritual. This was all consecutive. And after a while, I began to calculate it. I began to prepare myself for it.
When a survivor come in, they coming in to talk about what was done to them. And what we do, we process everything that happened to them and we point out what the perpetrator's done.
What I heard from Miss Freeman was some verbal violence, which also connected with some emotional violence in her life.
Her first husband was saying, "You're nothing without me. You ain't got no money, or you don't pretty much exist." And she thought that, so it, like, she internalized it.
What is it like to sit in one of these chairs and hear a woman's story for the first time and put yourself into your partner's shoes?
I do remember the impact of it, and it was profound. Like I heard it, and it blew my mind because my victims weren't allowed to speak, especially about my violence.
Any of my victims personally, I never got to hear how they felt about anything that I've done to them. It's hard to be empathetic when outside in the streets, you know. But being in here with my head clear, it's like I'm starting to see that empathy is part of who I authentically am.
A 2005 study found that after 16 weeks in RSVP, recidivism in the first year of release dropped by more than 80%.
You know, we talk about domestic violence as a women's issue for such a long time. But if 85% of the victims are women, and the vast majority of them are in heterosexual relationships, this is not a women's issue. It's a men's issue. It's just short-sighted not to look at the person who's causing the problem to deal with the problem. And I think we'll really start to see now what the potential for restorative justice is.
All right. So what do you think? Did that resonate with you? Susan, go ahead.
I get why she's focusing on restorative justice. I totally get that. Because obviously what we've been doing in the past has not worked. So that I truly do agree with her. And really the entire criminal justice system needs to become restorative justice anyway. So that part I get. However, there's a caveat here for me. What all of these people are not really addressing is something that Heidi said that resonated with me and has always resonated with me. And that is, men are the top of the power chain. They are. And even Black men, in spite of the fact that they are Black, they are still at the top of the chain in terms of Black women. And so even though they're not at the top of the whole chain, because white men are the top of that chain, they still are above women, considered that way in terms of power. Therefore, we still need to address this power system. And so that's why there is, along with critical race theory, there is gender theory. And I have always considered all of those critical theories together when I've taught. I have taught also, and I've taught critical race theory, gender theory, and queer theory all at once when I do my teaching about education in a pluralistic society, because all of that is important. And so without addressing the power chain, we still aren't going to get it, because the thing is, and we've seen from these videos that it all starts so young, and it starts at a time when girls are trying to figure out what the world is about. They're trying to figure everything out. They don't have inner strength yet. They don't have a strong identity yet. And so they are still left. If we don't address that power chain, they're still left, without what they really need. So I think that is still something I would like to see.
Thank you for bringing up that point and highlighting the influence of intersectionality in so many of the discussions that we have here. So yeah, that intersectionality piece is critical. And again, we just saw a snippet of the project, and I forget what number video it was, but when they were talking about sexual abuse is not about sex, I think domestic abuse is rooted in power and dominance. And so in order, I agree with you, in order to address the root of that, you have to talk about power. And one thing that resonated with me when the man at the end said that it was important for him to hear a victim's story because his victims were never allowed to speak, especially about his abuse. And I'm like, wow, if you are not confronted with the impact of your actions, I would think it would be nearly impossible for you to be motivated to change those actions if you're not confronted with the impact. And that alone might not do it, but I don't know how that happens without that being a piece of it. Thank you everyone for sharing. We have a little bit of time left. Is there anything from this last video or any of the videos? Hopefully there was a through line there and they all made sense together. But any kind of final reflections that we learned, just a heads up, Kim, I am coming to you next. Because one of the things that we like to discuss when we have these courageous conversations is what can we do to be impactful in a positive way. And I think you have a specific perspective that you could share some insight on that. So I'm coming to you next. Before we turn the floor over to Kim for a moment, any kind of final thoughts or questions that you want to pose to the group? Neil beautifully ran through our 4 agreements. So it's not that we're going to answer all of these questions or solve the world problems which relate to domestic violence, but is there anything else that you wanted to discuss before we shift? Heidi, you're muted.
I have one thing to share before we go on. And I want to say thank you to Susan for saying that because all while we were watching the video, I was thinking how I needed to apologize for making that statement. And it's either because of my personality, my culture, or my trauma. I don't know which. But
that intersectionality.
Oh my gosh, and it's fear of saying something that you're not supposed to say and being reprimanded for doing it, and that was a big part of I think of what I went through, right? It was that mental, emotional, don't tell anybody, don't say anything, that I talk to you this way, that I do these things to you, because if you do, you're going to get me so mad, I'm going to leave you, I'm not going to, that whole dependency, right? So I was thinking I should apologize for saying that, because that's not true of all Asians. They're not all like that. But, in, again, those traditional families where deep rooted, it's old school, right? That is real, but again, thank you for saying that, because I was so thinking that way. And I appreciate that feedback because it makes me feel good. So thank you.
Look at us supporting each other.
Yeah, it's amazing.
All right, Kim, the floor is yours. Tell us how we can be helpful. How can we make a positive impact? What do we need to be doing?
Well, so I guess one of the things I heard several times was, having a safe place for someone to go without judgment is mostly what a lot of times survivors and victims of crimes are looking for. In my role right now, it's more system-based and not community-based. So a lot of my goals are surrounded around a person's safety and what that looks like. And a lot of times that is much different than what a victim or survivor perceives or wants. Honestly, they are often in these relationships that, once somebody's arrested, once they leave, that it's going to stop the domestic abuse, but it's not. It usually continues after that because of familial relationships with shared children, family members, and things of that nature. Oftentimes, victims become isolated because part of that control that abuser has obtained and enforced on a victim in most circumstances, and physically, emotionally, economically, all those factors go into play in that situation. They often get isolated because, for example, like today, I have a case where a victim in one of my cases posted $12,000 cash for bond on her abuser. Well, then what happened was next, he ended up committing new crimes of domestic abuse against her. And in turn, what that's now caused is for that money to be forfeited and her lost at $12,000. And it's a hard day for me because systemically, that's what it states bond is there for. That's what's going to happen if you post this bond, or could likely happen. But as a person that works with domestic abuse victims, I know she's finally gotten to the point that she left, and now she's being pulled back in because she is going to be financially bound for a little while. And I think that it's going to lead to her probably experiencing some doubt about the direction she's going with her life right now, and whether that abuser is going to be in it any further, because it's going to be difficult for her. So it's sad because we have these systems in place that should work, and we put in place to protect, people and victims and survivors, but the system's always not the best either. The recidivism rate in a lot of these cases and a lot of these programs that what I call defendants or abusers attend is extremely high. I often, I don't want to say become friendly, but because of the nature of domestic abuse and the control and power aspect of it, and that those phases that they can go through continuously with the honeymoon and things like that, I see the same people over and over again, and not always with the same abuser. It could be a totally new relationship that they're now being abused in. And it's sad to me because, like I said, victims, they're looking for a safe place, and sometimes they end up going to another abuser for that safe place. So I encourage you all to really talk about this, even in hard conversations where it's not comfortable, because it's never going to be comfortable to talk about. Just know that. And think about those people, and think about when you're in the grocery store and you see something that doesn't seem right, stopping and saying, "Are you okay?" There's nothing wrong with that. I think any domestic abuse survivor will tell you that oftentimes somebody that stopped them, a random stranger in a grocery store, noticed something out of character about them. And it was just that moment that clicked for them, that even this stranger who doesn't have any familiarity with me noticed something is wrong. And that's something that I think is hard for people to do because they want to stay out of it and they don't want to be involved out of safety reasons sometimes, or many other different aspects of it, or trauma they suffered themselves. That's completely understandable. Just know that that victims and survivors, they're stuck in a pattern, and they're stuck with being manipulated for a long time, and their brains being what I call warped into a sense of care and love that really isn't there. So I encourage y'all, talk about it a lot, even in hard places. Talk about it with each other, and make sure that you understand that isolation is really a hard point for a victim, and usually the part where a victim stays longer. So keeping your house open, keeping your door open to conversations is going to help that.
Kim, thank you so much for that. And in scenarios where we could intervene in real time, is there like a universal, like a number or a website or something that maybe we could jot down on a piece of paper and just slip to someone. Because again, you want to make sure that you're safe when you're trying to connect with someone else or get them information. But is there something simple that we should know that we might not know that could be really impactful?
I think in our community here in Rock County, the YWCA and the Defy Center are numbers I hand out every day, multiple times a day. They're numbers that I've been asked to give, and they're numbers that I've offered for people too. They have really great personal support, confidentiality aspects of it, because a lot of times victims and survivors don't want the police involved or not ready for that. And we don't want to force them into something like that, because that is also going to shut down a survivor. So knowing what is available in your community, knowing what is available in wherever you're at is always important, and keeping those things in mind. The YWCA phone number, I think Heidi can give you that, but I also have it memorized, 752-2583. Same thing for the Defy Center. That's out of Beloit and more of like southern Wisconsin and the Illinois area, top Illinois areas too. So those would be the two that I specifically think are great. There's also, like somebody mentioned, that crisis line and 911 and non-emergency and those things too. So yep.
Carrie is behind the scenes putting that important information in the chat. So thank you so much for that, Carrie.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So that concludes our conversation. Really robust. We're going to shift into announcements, and then I will turn the floor over to Neil, and he will open up the parking lot, which is unmoderated, but it's additional and it's unrecorded. So there's additional time. If people still have some things that they want to talk about and discuss and flesh out, there will definitely be space for that. I am going to put some information in the chat about an upcoming event, and I am going to share my screen. And Heidi, please give us more information about this Wednesday's Walk a Mile.
Yes. Well, one thing I want to tell you all is that Kim on our call is actually going to be speaking at the beginning of the event. Also, we're taking a little bit of a twist here. You know, we are going to have not only one of our clients who's going to share their personal story, which is amazing. I'm going to tell you right now. We're also having somebody like Kim who works on a piece of this, this program that we have, as well as Angie, who is our assistant director for Alternative to Violence program. So they will be talking at about 5:30 p.m. that day. So this event kicks off Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It is a fundraiser for the YWCA. We will be on Festival Street this Wednesday. Shoe fittings at 4:30. The walk is free. It's at 5:30. It's a mile. If you'd like to join us, please come join us. And when the walk is done, there will be a food truck there. There'll be lots of fun things for kids to do, as well as some beverages. So please join us if you can. It's going to be amazing. It's a really fun event. Men come and walk a mile in her shoes. So men come, get fitted for women's shoes, walk a mile, and it is amazing to see some of the guys. It's pretty funny. Some people really get really into it. So we love they come to again help us with the cause. See if there's anything else here. We do have picnic tables there, but again, it's limited. So if you want to sit, bring lawn chairs and picnic blankets. Lots of people do that. And we do have also a silent auction. If you go to our website, you can click on, okay, Carrie, did I say that right? Carrie can't respond to this. So you can, if you want, silent auction items. We do have them, and they go until October 1st. And you can support the event that way if you can't make it there. And I think it's givebutter.com. Oh, it's a long one. Let's just put it this way. If you want to find out more about it, contact me at the YWCA and I will point you in the right direction. And maybe what I can also do, Amy, if I get you the link, can you send it out to the group?
Carrie already.
Looks like Carrie. I was just going to tap you.
She already dropped it in the chat, and it looks like
Thank
the silent auction goes through October 1st.
Yes, it was something, it's long, right? And it's something that I don't think anybody can remember that. So it's a little, combination.
Yeah, and a little
WAM
trick.
and Give Butter.
If you just click on it now, it'll open in your browser, and then you can go back to it when you have a moment. No pressure, but just saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heidi. Great job. So next up is a personal favor, our Racial Justice Conference. We are gearing up, and as many of you may be aware, the Dorothy Height Diversity in the Workplace Award is near and dear to my heart. She was an amazing woman. She actually shares a birthday with my daughter. Fun fact. And there's an absolutely gorgeous crystal award that YWCA Rock County presents at our Racial Justice Conference. But what's most important is the criteria of why we present this award. We want to acknowledge and support any organization or business that is located and operates within Rock County that has a proven track record that is committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So the information, a brief kind of synopsis of the criteria for the award is there in the chat. Also, the link if you want to submit an organization or a company in Rock County. The deadline is Friday, October 6th at 5 o'clock, and the link is there. You can support or nominate a business or organization that you are a part of, or one that you are not a part of. So just briefly, this is how this works. If you nominate an organization that you are not a part of, I will reach out to them and let them know that assuming that you do it before October 6th at 5 o'clock, that they have been nominated, and is there additional information that they would like for the nomination committee to consider. So the moral is, if you are thinking about nominating, but maybe I can't answer the questions or I don't have all of the information that the committee is requesting, nominate anyway, and then I'll reach out and hopefully they can fill in some of the blanks. Neil, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
I just, you mentioned the conference, and that is scheduled for the 9th of November. It's an all-day conference, and it's virtual, I understand. Is that correct?
Oh, Neil, you're making my job easy. That is my last announcement. We are gearing up for our 9th annual Racial Justice Conference. This year, our theme is a question. Is fear keeping us from eliminating racism? We will be out shortly with our full roster of speakers, but that is quickly coming together. Registration opened today, so very exciting. Early registration is $100. It is from 8:30 to 4:30. We are in the works to put. We're doing this virtually. One, this is a fundraiser, and that's fiscally responsible to do, so that we can focus on the fundraising aspect, but still delivering a really great quality product. But we have heard in the feedback that people enjoy virtual, but some of us miss getting together across the table and having a conversation. So we are in the midst of planning a post-conference in-person component. So what that would look like is that a week or so after the conference, we'll gather together at as central a location as we can find, and we'll talk about in deeper we'll go deeper on one of the topics that we highlighted at the conference. So I'm really looking forward to that. And if that goes well, please however it goes, I'm sure it will be well. Give us your feedback, because that's how we came up with this idea. So your feedback is really important to us. So the information for the conference and the conference graphic is there in the chat. So feel free to share that widely. All right, I have done a lot of talking. Neil, Amy, are there any announcements from Diversity Action Team or Community Action that we need to be aware of?
I don't know anything from Diversity Action, but another event in November is the NAACP Freedom Banquet. Janet's nodding her head. I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, Janet. You're muted.
It's going to be at the Eclipse Center in Beloit on the 2nd of November, as you said. It's a banquet, and there's an excellent speaker, although at this moment I can't remember who it is, but I'm looking forward to seeing her so much. The cost is $75, and if you're not a member of the NAACP, with that cost, you will get a membership. So I think it's going to be really a good event, and I wish I had more information to pass on, but I will do it at our next Courageous Conversations.
Janet, thank you so much. Amy, anything from Community Action?
The big thing is that this is not directly related to community action, but community action has been getting a lot of requests for rental assistance, and the Wisconsin Emergency Rental Assistance Program is back up and running for now with some more funds. And so if people need that assistance, or if you're looking, the state is running that, but they can contact Community Action's main number for information.
Thank you for being an advocate on Community Action, a facilitator of those important funds. All right, I am going to end the recording, and Neil, the floor is yours to open the parking lot.
And while Kim